Welcome back, Social 10. Today, we're going to leave here learning more and understanding more about argumentation on what I call an A2, an argumentative essay. So in your notes, let's find a section that you've been taking notes on how to do an A2. If you don't have a section like that, maybe let's make a section. So the title today might be Adding Argumentation to Our A2. Now, as you prepare, I want to give you some background information here that the assignment is an argumentative essay. And although currently the marking criteria, the rubric, scores 8 marks towards argumentation and 8 towards evidence, it's been discussed at the provincial level if we were going to add more weighting to one of those two categories, it really should be argumentation, because it is an argumentative essay, not a report. And as I've been mentioning to you, you guys are fantastic at giving me evidence, but what is missing sometimes is purpose, is some kind of attachment back to your position and from your position back to the source. So I hope that you can leave here today knowing more about argumentation. If you are currently struggling with argumentation, fear not. We still have 2 years to correct this, and you are a part of what I would argue the majority. A number of people in the province write essays, A2 essays, argumentative papers in social studies, and it comes across as a report. They give us a lot of evidence. So I'm going to leave you with some hints today. The first hint that I want to bring up is the idea of your argumentation comes back to your thesis statement. So we can set ourselves up for more insightful, more sophisticated argumentation, more comprehensive argumentation, by having a more impressive, comprehensive, insightful, sophisticated thesis statement. So what I'm saying is, when I give you an E or a PF or an S, 180 or 60 for argumentation, I need to be able to pull sentences out of your work and say, this is where it's an E. This is an E statement. This is where your argument is insightful, sophisticated, deliberate, judicious, insightful. I already said insightful, but that's how insightful it is. It's double insightful. And I would argue, what better sentence than your thesis statement? So I do have an attached document to our lesson here today. And in the attached document, it shows a sample thesis statement that can set your body up for comprehensive argumentation. So here's a thesis statement about a topic we've been talking about this week in class. Human rights, reasonable limits, relationship between government and governed, that kind of conflict between freedom and control, individualism and collectivism. Although liberty is desirable, there are times when freedoms cannot be absolute. The danger becomes that in the name of security, freedom might be lost, and the state might become dystopian. Therefore, we need a state powerful enough to restrict freedom when necessary, but also a citizenry active enough to shape their relationship with their government. That's argumentation, right? There's no evidence yet. That's argumentation. That's my position. So we have a source, and your position needs to be tied to your source. So if there's language in the source, maybe words like liberty or freedom or citizens or government, then I want to build my position around those big rocks of the source so that it's clear that my position is a response to the source. And once I build that position, then it should be that the position can be divided into what I would call smaller arguments. So here we've got argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, argument 4, argument 5, all under the umbrella that is your position that is a response to the source. 5 arguments. So we may not have 2 body paragraphs. In this case, you may have 5. And I think before we write the final exam in 10-1, you should be able to anticipate what kind of body paragraphs you're going to have based upon the themes that we've been talking about all year, about the nature of mankind, about paradigm shifts, about the flaws and the cornerstones of globalization. So we will work on that together before one day you just flip the exam over and say, oh, you should be able to flip it over and say, oh, I've done some preparation for this. I've prepared some arguments. So these are 5 arguments that you could have underneath that umbrella, that thesis statement, that position. Liberty is desirable. There are times when freedoms cannot be absolute. the danger becomes that in the name of security, we will lose liberty and drift into controlled dystopias. But under each of those arguments, I would say we can add more. And those will be our next hints. Any questions about the first hint? Have a very comprehensive, impressive, sophisticated thesis. Now, before we move on, though, there's a bit of a warning that we cannot provide a promise in a thesis statement that we don't deliver later in our body. So if in my thesis, as we can see in this one, I use the language of dystopian, if in my body I never come back to the concept of dystopian, by definition I've incompletely defended my position. Now I've gone to an L. So the caution is, if you have a very ambitious thesis, a very ambitious position, the caution is make sure that you fulfill your promise. If you don't, if you're at the conclusion, you're like, you know what, I didn't have time to talk about dystopian, go back and reword your thesis statement so that you haven't incompletely fulfilled your promise. So that is hint number 1 about, I have way too many windows open. Hint number 1 about how to ensure we have a focus on argumentation. Hint number 2, have your topic sentences connect back to the thesis. Last week we did an assignment where we didn't write an essay, but we really wrote the body of an essay. And in the body you had to say mankind is this, this, and this. Irrational, irresponsible, but maybe compassionate. And each one of those characteristics of mankind, logically, was the theme or the focus of a body paragraph. Some of your body paragraphs were introduced by a topic sentence that was an introduction to evidence. So a topic sentence that introduces evidence, I would say, is a missed opportunity to sell me, to defend your position. So your topic sentence should always be a argumentative sentence that does introduce the paragraph. Each paragraph has a different focus, right? But it should logically link back to your thesis, and your thesis links back to the source. Source has inspired your thesis as a response. Your thesis is divided into topic sentences. So your topic sentences should be arguments. We don't want your topic sentence to be an introduction to evidence. So what would be a topic sentence that would be evidence-based? There were, 90 million casualties during World War II. That sounds like you're giving me a report. Link that to argumentation, and then give me the numbers. Make the statement, then quantify it with the evidence, or then qualify it with the evidence. So please have your topic sentences connect back to the thesis and be statements of argumentation, not a introduction to evidence. The third hint here is at the beginning of each body paragraph, before you jump straight to evidence, because that's our tendency, because our minds were fascinated with evidence. But before you jump straight to the evidence and give me the report, you have an opportunity to add voices to your own. So if your position is that liberty is desirable, and let's say that this is a take-home essay, you could do some Googling and say, quotes that support liberty, or quotes about liberty. And then you'll see all of these quotes about liberty, and then you can pick one judiciously that defends your argument, that furthers your argument. So what we can do is add voices to your own. So I would argue at the beginning of your body paragraph, let's say that we have a body paragraph talking about liberty is desirable, there's room there to add supporting arguments. So another idea to strengthen your argumentation is to have supporting arguments. So what are other ways that we can make a statement that liberty is desirable? Are there other ways we can say that? Another way we can say that is to use quotes from people like Benjamin Franklin. When Franklin says, those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety, they deserve neither liberty nor safety. So that's a quote from Benjamin Franklin that is rewording your position. Liberty is desirable. He's furthering your position. And that makes your argumentation mark stronger. So hint number 3 is that in that body, let's add supporting arguments. And one place to add them might be at the beginning as you kind of wrestle with the concept you're going to talk about in that paragraph. So if the paragraph is talking about liberty being desirable, then wrestle with the concept of liberty before you dive into depth and breadth of evidence. Any questions about hint number 3? Hint number 4 is we can use related terms that sound like unsound, instead of irrational to make supporting arguments. So ideally, your body paragraph will have your opening, your topic sentence. That's a statement of argumentation. Maybe some supporting arguments, quotes from people like Einstein or Gandhi, or maybe Eleanor Roosevelt. She says a lot about human rights. But then you're going to start giving us evidence, right? But as you move from case study to case study to case study, and this is the big step people forget, as you move from case study to case study to case study, as you transition between case studies, check back in with your argument. Ensure that we understand how your evidence has just proved your argument correct. Again, I had university professors that used to always tell me, so what and who cares? Because I used to be one of those students that would write evidence and evidence and evidence. And, my papers would be very long and they would get tired. They would get fatigued because they're searching for the position and it's lost in all that evidence. So when you're giving evidence, you need to give the evidence with purpose. And when you transition from one case study to the next, make sure that there's some kind of link back to your position. So one thing I find myself circling a lot on the rubric is that concept that we need to create more relationships, more links between our position and evidence. Now, if the topic of the paragraph is mankind's irrational, and we have 10 pieces of evidence, we don't want to use the word irrational 10 times, then it becomes so repetitive that your argumentation might actually be lowered by all these check-ins, right? So one of the things we need to do is understand that there's other ways to say irrational. So, I just Google the word irrational and look for words that mean irrational. And we have words like absurd, ridiculous, ludicrous, silly, foolish, senseless, unjustifiable, unfounded, baseless, groundless, illogical, unreasonable, unsound. I may not be able to find a piece of evidence that links with each of those words, but I could find some evidence that links to most of those words. And instead of saying mankind's irrational 8 times, sometimes I'm saying the unfound, logic that seems to, or the unsound logic that seems to shape mankind's actions can be reflected in, when we look at speculative investing or gambling on the stock market in the 1920s. Or if we're not looking at buying on the margin, maybe we're going to look at the conditions that combined to create the financial crisis of 2008, the housing bubble. So we can look at how that was unsound logic, right? Unsound logic created a problem. You can look at how it could be unjustifiable to exploit others. You can look at, the illogical, the unreasonable, the ludicrous things that we're doing to the biosphere. So I would argue that when we do step 4, when we connect our evidence back to our argument, our main argument, with supporting arguments, this is a chance to show off that if your paragraph's about irrational, show off that you know other words that mean irrational. So then your argument's not repetitive, your argument can be more comprehensive. Because you're demonstrating that under the umbrella of irrational, we're behaving illogically, we're behaving in a foolish way, we're behaving in a ridiculous way, an absurd way, an unsound way. Now, you might be sitting there and saying, wow, this sounds like a lot of work. How would I ever do this in an exam? So before the exam, you need to do some studying. How do you study for an essay? You need to pre-plan what you could write in the essay. So if in January on our final exam, you're going to be creating an argument that globalization has exposed the illogical nature of mankind, what's the most deliberate, the most judicious evidence to continue that? That's the stuff you need to do before the exam. Yeah. So that's how you study for a written response. And that may mean that going into the exam, you've prepared 20, 30, 40 arguments, and on the exam you may end up using 8. But if you don't do that preparation before the exam, you're going to have difficulty finishing the exam in the allotted time. You have to go into the contest prepared. Hopefully the Oilers prepare for their opponent, right? The exam source is your opponent. You must prep for it. And this is how you prep for it. You have to predict what kind of arguments you could be making. And I'm telling you that the exam is going to be about globalization, our nature, our cornerstones that we have built the global village around, individualism, collectivism, and I think that under this umbrella we can begin to do this prepping somewhat together so that I can guide you through it. So that's hint 4. Hint 4 is to link your evidence back to your argument before you move on to new evidence. But when you do it, don't keep using the word irrational. Use related words like senseless, unfounded, unreasonable, illogical. And with those words, I would argue that you could actually prep before the exam and say, what's the most deliberate? Because there's lots of evidence that fits that, we have an unsound foundation within the global village. But what's the best evidence? And if we've learned anything this week in our classes, that some evidence is more convincing than others. Now we have step 5. Again, support your main arguments with supporting arguments. And because I said earlier, when I mark your paper, I need to be able to pull a sentence and say, this is the moment that you become insightful, or this is the moment that your argumentation shows that it's been judiciously chosen and defended. Well, I shared with you a document earlier this week that has links to all of the released diploma exams, all the released writing exemplars. And if you go to those, if you go to what we call the rationale, we pull out parts of these sample essays and say this is the moment in that essay that we can identify that it's an E or a PF or an S. So then, if you look at those exemplars, you can see some strategies that you can put into your own writing. So what strategy are we seeing here? We're seeing supporting arguments. And the nice thing is, often, it's going to be a direct quote. So they're saying that, the position that ultimately we must, so that's the thesis statement, is convincingly supported by judiciously chosen and developed arguments. So if we have a plan going in, that these are my supporting arguments, it's more likely my argumentation mark will be higher. And then when we execute that plan, we might have statements like this. First of all, it is sometimes necessary for nations to adopt policies that will block another nation's pursuit of a goal in order to defend the liberal principles that nation was built upon. Now I've made a supporting argument that logically demands some evidence now, right? If somebody says that, now you want to say, prove it. So the argumentation leads the evidence. Argument comes first. The evidence has a purpose to defend the argument that you just made. So in these body paragraphs, it might be, kind of like a really nice sandwich, right? Not a hamburger. We don't want like argument, evidence, argument. That's a very simple sandwich. I want a more complex sandwich. There might be argument, evidence, argument, evidence, argument, evidence, argument, evidence. I'm very gluttonous. I want a very complex sandwich. I want many layers. I want pickles and lettuce and onions and lots of mustard, obviously, and more than one patty on this burger. And I hate cheese, so leave that crap out of there. But, there's lots of layers to this, not just so simple like argument, evidence, argument. So most of the time you guys give me like a very thin little bun, like a big chunk of like hamburger patty that somebody would choke on, and then a thin little bun at the end, or sometimes you don't even put a bun at the end. So then there's like no point, and I'm getting grease all over my hands. Don't leave me with greasy hands when I read your paper. That's a horrible metaphor. Let's continue. Always connect your argumentation with the perspective of the source and your evidence. And again, that's shown here on this part of the same rationale from the same essay. That the relationship between the position taken and the ideological perspective presented in the source is perceptively developed. For example, in most other circumstances, however, when liberal principles are not being compromised, impeding the self-interest of another nation goes against the principles of liberalism themselves. Making a statement like that off the top of your head during an exam could be very difficult. That's why we need to prep going in. We need to prep arguments that you may need to make. You may need to make. And there's many exemplars shown of that. So in summary, we began the year by focusing on analysis of source. And as a group, we're proficient or excellent at that. And then we focused on evidence. And as a group, if it's a take-home, you guys are beyond excellent. The next challenge there will be retaining the evidence in a closed book exam. But the final obstacle for you at this point, based upon what I've read, is strengthening your argumentation. So how do we do that? It begins with thesis statements that are impressive and comprehensive, and we've worked together on thesis statements. But it also means that you need to have topic sentences. That's a statement of argumentation, not an introduction of evidence. It means that maybe we take advantage of your paragraph and you add more voices to your own argument, supporting arguments from others, quotes. It means that we don't keep using the same word like irrational. We use other words to make supporting arguments. When are we making those supporting arguments? We make them to introduce evidence, and we make them to conclude evidence, to wrap that evidence up in a nice little package as to why we're doing it. Always connect your evidence to your argumentation. So the final step in unlocking this, like hint number 7, I guess, is to prepare. Prepare those arguments. So we'll have to create another document where we look at what types of arguments are you likely going to be forced to make on your exam. And that's that.